A very happy new year to all of you. Now, 2020 was a historic year for all the bad reasons, and I hope 2021 becomes a historic year for all the good reasons. Now, the good thing with this whole idea of new year is that while it's just a change of date, it brings in a lot of hope, energy, and enthusiasm in our lives. More optimism, more positivity. I'm Adit Gupta, and today I would like to talk about design and philosophy. Now, I received some good interest in this topic when I tweeted about it in 2019, and many of you wanted to know more about it. But my objective was to complete my master's first so that I can have more well formed thoughts about this topic. And while I'm still learning and reflecting, I think I'm in a better position to tell you more about this conjunction. Now, I would like to begin by establishing a structure around this talk. Everything that I'll speak will be contained in this structure. So, the backbone of this talk is thinking. When I refer to thinking, it's not just design thinking or critical thinking, but thinking as a conscious, directed activity of the mind. Something that Kahneman referred as slow thinking or systems to thinking. Now, whenever I read philosophy or for that matter anything else, there is this tendency to connect it with design. And sometimes it leads to deeper insights. There's always this designer lens that comes into play. So, I have taken the liberty to apply some of the philosophical ideas to design. Now, some of the things that I read in philosophy can be directly linked to our design practice. These philosophical ideas can be used to make improvements to our methods and processes, the way we define and implement them. On the other end of the spectrum, we have reflexivity or meta thoughts, which I think is fundamental to every philosopher. And doing philosophy has also made me think meta about design. So I have deliberated on what is design and why do we design the way we design. So my thoughts here are still in metamorphosis process, that is like they are changing and shaping all the time. But I think this is where the intersection of design and philosophy comes out at its best, that can lead to a change in fundamental ideas about design, both in theory and in practice. Okay, so we start with the understanding phase of design, where our purpose is to observe, ask, synthesize before we think of any solutions. And first up is the Socratic method, which is well known to both philosophers and lawyers. It's a dialogue approach for doing philosophy, a rally of questions and answers to understand the subject matter more deeply. And the key is to ask questions, many of them. Because once you start asking questions, you realize that things are not as straightforward as we once assumed them to be. It's about challenging beliefs, biases, and assumptions which do come into play when we design. And while I understand that you can't get rid of all your existing beliefs and biases, the Socratic method will help you uncover them and understand them better. In fact, I highly recommend reading the Euthyphro dialogue, which exemplifies the Socratic method and questions the beliefs around God, morality, and justice. You will find a link to it in the description. Now, there are occasions on which you can end up in a state of aporia when using the Socratic method. And this aporia is a state of puzzle or doubts when you don't have clear answers. That's the only thing I would caution for when you are using this method for design. You don't want to be in a perpetual state of doubt when designing for people. And even though there might not be clear answers all the time, you will have to take a stand for something. Now, I have developed my own little method for asking questions in design that I refer to as the query map. The idea is to implement the Socratic method to ask questions around people, business, and technology. And all these questions are connected to each other, and there are follow up questions to the initial set of questions. I have provided a link to a template of query map in the description. Okay, now let's move on with phenomenology. This is one of the disciplines in philosophy that's not so easy to grasp. but it is certainly something that can make you rethink the way you practice design research. So, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines phenomenology as the study of structures of consciousness as experienced from the first person point of view. Well, simplifying it, basically, the definition is saying that it is concerned with the way in which object shows itself or how it appears. It is experience directed towards something from a first person perspective. Now, I understand that this still sounds a little vague or abstract. So let's consider an example which is given by Dan Zahavi in his book on phenomenology. So he talks about the appearance of an alarm clock. You always look at the clock from a certain perspective and in a certain context and environment. You might just see the top, front, or back of the alarm clock from your own position in the room. And also, it will have different meanings in different contexts. It can be an important artifact in a design sprint, but well, not so important one at home. So you see how our own conscious experience can have multiple angles to it. There's perspective, there is context, there's the environment, and there is also temporality to it. And this is what it means when we say that phenomenology is the study of structures of consciousness as experienced from the first person point of view. Now, there are certain methods to help us attain this phenomenological task, and one of them is bracketing, which says that you have to suspend your judgments, preconceived notions, and your prejudices towards objects and things. Because if you come with your own existing beliefs and biases, you're not truly going to experience the object. So let's take this idea of bracketing and use it when you're talking to people for research or when you're synthesizing information. The questions that you have to ask yourself is that, can you get rid of your baggage and just listen and understand people's experiences? Can you suspend your judgments and preconceived notions when you are synthesizing? So now I apologize to philosophers listening to this for a different interpretation of phenomenological methods, but I think that this disambiguation of sorts, it does help in design. And there is a lot to phenomenology that than what I have talked about here. There is epoch, there is eidetic variation, there is transcendental reductions, and other methods and concepts which I have not covered here because this might get too deep for this talk. But having said that, I recently came across this idea of microphenomenology in research. And according to its formal definition, microphenomenology is a qualitative second person interview for the research of first person accounts of lived experiences. So let me simplify this. The idea is to interview participants to unfold and understand their experiences rather than just asking them what and why questions. The focus now shifts from what to how. For example, the interviewer will ask, how do you know that this was a satisfying experience? And the interviewer needs to help people describe tactile experiences, how they feel, and how it has changed them. We need to get as much detail as possible. Now, there is a lot to the entire practice of microphenomenology that is beyond this talk. However, I have given a link about it in the description if you are interested to know more about it. Okay, so let's move ahead with Wittgenstein and language games. Now, Wittgenstein, the man in the picture, was one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century who made significant contribution in analytical philosophy and linguistics. And he is known for his two works, The Picture Theory of Language and Language Games. And today we'll briefly look into language games. So here's the core idea. We know that language is woven into all human activities and behavior. And we use language in different contexts in different ways. So we use language to describe, affirm, deny, ask questions, tell stories, express emotions, speculate, translate, and so on. And all these different activities are referred by Wittgenstein as language games. And it's a game because you need to understand the rules before you start using the language with others. So it means that we need to understand the context, culture, environment, people, and also that there cannot be a private language. Now, let me take a few examples here. Think about the word vector. Now, depending on your profession, you might think of it in different ways. Well, for a designer, it's related to images. For a biologist, it's a disease carrier. And for a physicist, it's a quantity with magnitude and direction. Or think of saying the word water. Now, depending on the context, the utterance water could be an order, the answer to a question, or some other form of communication. Or, let me take an example which might be like more relevant to design. So, let's say, I talk about the sentence that the agent is working on your ticket. Well, what does it mean? It can mean that a support agent is working on your technical problem, or it can also mean that a travel agent is working on booking your flight ticket. Right. So that's why it is important to understand the context, the environment, the culture, and the society. And that's the reason why ethnographic studies or contextual inquiries have a big role when we are designing products. So let's talk about different perspectives, which is best articulated in the Jain theory of Nayavāda. Now, according to Jain philosophy, Naya is to describe an object from one single and separate point of view. And this is best exemplified with the story of the elephant and the four blind men. And the story simply goes that these blind men approach an elephant and they're not aware that there is an elephant out there. So one of them touches the trunk and feels that, oh, it's a big snake. The other one touches the leg and feels that, oh, it's a tree stump. The third one, while touching the big ears of the elephant, feels like it's a sheath of leather. And the last one, while touching the tail of the elephant, feels like it's a little flurry mouse, right? So you see how different perspective here come into play, because all of them are looking at the elephant, or in fact, all of them are kind of touching the elephant from a single point of view. And this is where the idea of thinking from multiple perspective comes into play. So the idea is that when we are designing, we often look at things from a single perspective and fail to think about other intentions or even misuses of a product. I believe that we need to think beyond that persona thinking of looking at just some goals and designing for it. We have to consider different intent under different circumstances. And while it's true that we can't have all the answers or all the intents, we certainly can mitigate some of the unintended consequences. So, in the understanding phase, it's important to broaden our approach to think of different contexts and perspectives while being open to dialogue. Anything that's unidimensional will lead to problems. Okay, so let's talk about some philosophy in the ideation phase. And surprisingly, most insights for me here are more meta than being directly applicable to a method or a process. The fundamental question is, how do we design interfaces? What goes into transforming the synthesis of user research or your understanding of the problem into a screen interface? Well, there are some answers. You can say that we design interfaces based on certain principles related to information architecture, heuristics, and then apply them with our own understanding of design patterns. But my question is that, is it truly that mechanical? We just don't blindly apply patterns, or everything else out there would just look the same. And I have been thinking a lot about this question of transforming needs to interfaces. And while I don't have a singular objective answer, philosophy has catalyzed some interesting thoughts. So let's talk about David Hume. Now, Hume was one of the finest philosophers of the 18th century who made highly influential contribution to empiricism and naturalism. And as an empiricist, Hume thinks that everything we believe is ultimately traceable to experience. And he says that our perceptions can be divided into impressions and ideas. Now, impressions include sensations as well as desires, passions, and emotions. And ideas are the faint images of these impressions in thinking and reasoning. And he thinks that everyone will recognize this distinction since everyone is aware of the difference between feeling and thinking. It is the difference between, the feeling of pain, let's say when you touch a candle, and then recalling it later, right? So that's the difference between like impressions and ideas according to Hume. Now, let's take this philosophical approach to design, and I'll take a different spin to Hume's impressions and ideas. So, first of all, I'm not talking about like superficial impressions or influences that you get by looking at, let's say, dribble designs or by following some trend like skeuomorphism. Let's go deeper here. So, you get sense impressions all the time from everything around you. These are the things that you are directly experiencing. And I think that when these are registered in your memory or conscious experience, they sometimes come into play when you're generating design ideas. And it's not just visual to visual connection, it can be intrasensory. So, listening to that calm, peaceful music can lead to minimalistic visual ideas. Or maybe when you design after a trip to that Muji store, it can also bring some really nice, simple aesthetic ideas. In cognitive psychology, we call it priming. But in philosophical terms, I call it generation of complex ideas from impressions. The environment that you are part of will bring different ideas. Spending time in nature will bring different ideas as against spending time in the cubicle. And this is where we can say that designing interfaces is not just a mechanical activity of applying principles and patterns to your synthesis. It has a deeper connection to individuals, to their impressions and ideas. And this thought is a segue to the next topic of intuition and intellect. Now, this was discussed by Radhakrishnan in his epistemological studies. Radhakrishnan, as most of us, or in fact all of us know, that he was the first vice president of India, and he is also one of the finest Indian philosophers. Now, this is something which not many of us know, but he was really a great philosopher. And Radhakrishnan says that on one hand, we have our intellectual cognition to obtain knowledge through the process of analysis and synthesis, while on the other hand, we have intuitive apprehension, now, which is direct knowledge culminating in highest kind of immediacy. And going metaphysical, Radhakrishnan also says that in intuitive apprehension, we become one with the truth, one with the object of knowledge. Now, what about intuition and intellect together? Here, Radhakrishnan says that intuition needs intellect for the expression, elaboration, and justification of its results. Intellect, on the other hand, presupposes intuition, without which its deliberations cannot start. The functions of intellect is analysis, but there must be something to be analyzed, and that something must be whole. Now, think about this when you are ideating. Any idea begins with your intuition, which gets better with experience. But the kickoff point is driven by your intuition. That blank canvas will perhaps look more intimidating to a young designer as compared to an experienced one. And as you start working on the idea, your intellect comes into play, and the various elements in your design get connected to your research synthesis. I do believe that you need to provide rationals for your design, but you're not always analytical when you're designing. So I feel that design is driven by intuition but defined by intellect. Now, some of you who know me might be surprised to hear this because I have always asked for rationals for every single element in the design, a strong analytical positivist approach. And yes, this rationalizing holds, but this is not the approach when we are actually designing something. The intuition comes into play. And when you are doing a self analysis of your designs, all the rationality comes into play. So that's why I say that uh, design for me is like driven by intuition and defined by intellect. Okay, so now we can get even more meta, which brings us to the question: what is design, and how do we define design? And you can find many definitions out there based on different perceptions. But as a philosopher, I would like to begin with a definition of a definition, and then we can analyze some of the design definitions out there. So, a philosophical definition consists of a set of conditions that are individually necessary and jointly sufficient for being an instance of the concept. Right? So, this is the definition here: a set of conditions that are individually necessary and jointly sufficient. For example, being unmarried is a necessary condition to be a bachelor. And being unmarried, adult human, and a male are jointly sufficient for the concept of the bachelor. Right? So, with this understanding, let's look at some of the design definitions. Now, according to Google design is a way for us to deliver deep meaning to our customers through the experiences we craft. Right? But here's the thing, right? I think this is a very company oriented definition as against like a generic one. Also, it's vague. I mean, what is deep meaning? How do you define it? And we learned in our Wittgenstein section that deep itself can have many meanings depending on the individual and the context. And I don't see any necessary or sufficient conditions here. So honestly, I think we can best disregard it as a definition of design. Now, Donald Schoen says that design is a reflective conversation with the materials of a design solution. Now, this one is interesting. The materials of a digital interface can be the individual design elements and the information contained in them. And as you are interacting with the interface, there's a conversation of the digital with the human. And I think this is a bit more metaphysical. And this definition also doesn't provide us with the necessary and the sufficient conditions. But I still think that it's a pretty interesting one. Another definition of design, which I read in the book Philosophy of Design by Pearson, it says that design is the intentional solution of a problem by the creation of plans for a new sort of thing. Now, this one holds good with our philosophical definition, right? The intentional solution of a problem, the creation of plans, and a new thing, all of them are necessary conditions, and they are jointly sufficient to call something as designed. When we design something, the intention is to provide solution to a certain problem. We then create a plan for it and we execute it to make a new thing. And I would highly recommend reading Pearson's book on philosophy of design to know more about this particular definition. Now, I also came up with my own definition, I think a while back. I think this was sometime last year. And I thought that design is structuring of material to let beings attain their intended task with minimum learning. And here, structuring of material, I mean, the material can be like, if we talk about digital interfaces, it can be information interface components, or in the physical world, it can be like objects and parts. So we always structure them in a certain way. For beings, so rather than saying just human beings, I'm using a more generic word beings, because it's not necessary that we are always designing things for humans. I mean, especially if you're designing, let's say, some physical artifact, it can also be for animals, right? So design is structuring of material to let beings attain their intended task. Now this is where the intent and the goals uh, uh, come into play, which are directly connected to your design, and that's how you want to structure your material. And an important component here is minimum learning, and this actually directly is linked to our affordances and signifiers. If there are proper affordances, if there are affordances and if there are proper signifiers, then it will have minimum learning for the being. So I think that structuring of material for beings to attain their intended task with minimum learning are necessary and jointly sufficient condition for the definition of design. Now, I'm not saying that this is the perfect definition of design. I think I always go back and think about design as and when I'm learning new things. Uh, but do let me know about your own definition of design in the comments below. So, at this note, I think we have covered many parts which link philosophy with design. And there are many other things in philosophy, like arguments, fallacies, counterfactuals, things like post structuralism, postmodernism, contextualism. All of them can be connected to design ideas. And there are so many of them that your mind is like actually blown. Uh, but I think that will be like too much for this talk, and perhaps we can have part two of this talk sometime in future. So on that note, it brings us to the end of this presentation with the question that do we have an intersection between design and philosophy? And my answer is yes. I mean, we can call it philosophy of design. And in my experience, now there are some articles, there are some books out there which are referred to as philosophy of design, but they are mostly related to architecture. And I've hardly seen anything when it comes to a digital interface design. And I think this is where we have lots of scope to have a proper intersection between design and philosophy to come up with ideas that can shape or create fundamental ideas for design as we move into the future. So on that note, I would like to end this presentation. If you liked this video, like and subscribe, and I'm looking forward to again meet you in my next video. Thank you and have a good day.